Welcome to Azure Data Platform. Today we have a session by Eugene and the session Jaspersoft and SSRS. If you join us for the first time, you can follow us on different social media platforms. That was actually the last page. Perfect. Never mind. We're meeting every month, every third Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is today is not PST but PDT. Never mind. On Eventbrite, you can see all of our upcoming sessions, and you can also see those sessions on Meetup as well. Again, all the links for the social media. You can join our mailing list, and this way we can notify you on upcoming sessions. Also send you newsletters as well. And at the end of this meeting, we'll raffle a T-shirt. Again, this T-shirt is more custom than what we have right now, but it's still worth a T-shirt. And one thing is, of course, you need to be present, and because we cannot afford shipping outside of US, this is only going to be US. And the session today is sponsored by Data-Driven Technologies. This is basically a non-profit that funds this Azure group and also SQL Server in Los Angeles. And finally, I got to Azure Data Platform proudly presents Eugene. Let me try to pronounce the last name, which is actually easier than my last name. So it needs to be Meidinger.
Close enough. Meidinger.
Okay.
It's German, so
Meidinger.
I think everybody struggles with it. Yep.
Okay. Who's happened to be independent BI consultant and Pluralsight and Microsoft MVP.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That's more recent, so that's my fault.
I think I didn't copy that.
Yeah.
So it's all my fault. So never mind. And without further ado, let's transfer to Eugene.
Yep. And then I think Maximiliana was asking to do the page, the YouTube information. Okay. So this is going to be this isn't going to be an interesting talk because Jaspersoft is one of those things where as a Pluralsight author, sometimes I have to learn a technology that I haven't worked with before. And Jaspersoft is definitely one of those. But Steve was like, hey, I saw you did a course on it. Can you do a talk on it? I'm like, okay, sure. So we're going to compare Jaspersoft to SQL Server reporting services. It's a lot more heavy on the Jaspersoft side because my expectation is a lot of you have some general experience or understanding of SSRS. But if you don't or you have questions, please feel free to interrupt. There's not a huge number of us, so I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. I'm also happy at the end to talk about just whatever, what's it like being a Pluralsight author or Power BI or SSRS or any of that kind of stuff. So real quick about me, a couple things. One, I am a full-time Pluralsight author. So what that means is that I make most of my money from making courses. I'm hoping to spend most of my time making courses. Last year was kind of a mess, but my goal is I'd like to make a course every 1 to 2 months. And so really hoping I can kind of ramp that up this year. So I'm optimistic. I'm also a business intelligence consultant. So that died down a bit during COVID, but there's been some projects that have been coming up, and my consulting is almost primarily Power BI. For the right price, I'll consult on anything, but I used to do quite a bit of SSRS work at my last job, but it's probably been a good 3 or 4 years since I was just on a daily basis working with SSRS. But I definitely have quite a bit of familiarity with it. And then finally, as of September 1st, I am a Microsoft MVP. So I'm very honored to have that as well. So enough about me. let's talk about Jaspersoft and SSRS. So we're going to talk about what is Jaspersoft, a little bit about how does it work, or at least the components involved, or how you would get started with it. Throughout the talk, I'll be comparing it to SSRS. And again, if there's something that is unclear, you have a question about, please feel free. And then I'll show you just a really, really simple demo of how you might create a report in Jaspersoft. So this will be just going through the wizard and just the bare bone templates, but at least you can see what it looks like. And what you're going to find is if you've worked with SSRS, Jaspersoft is eerily similar. Is going to be kind of the big lesson from today, is that I describe it to people literally, it's as if SSRS was written in Java. And we'll talk at the end about which one you should go with, and the answer very well might be neither. This is what Jaspersoft looks like, or at the very least Jaspersoft Studio. So this is actually based on Eclipse. And over on the left, we've got our projects and our specific files within them. And then in the center, we've got our reporting, and we're going to have our design pane and our preview pane, and it's based on XML. And then over on the right, we've got our canvas items. And for those, we can set a bunch of properties. And what you're going to find is SSRS looks very, very similar. It's the same kind of ideology, same kind of process. This is a picture from some Microsoft documentation. And so when would you want to use Jaspersoft? So Jaspersoft, in my mind, is good for three things in particular. Pardon me, I'm still coming back from London time. So one of the things that Jaspersoft is really good for, and SSRS as well, is printing. It's paginated reporting, so it's reports that have a page number. And so you get a lot of fine-grained control over how it looks, margins, fonts, colors, all this kind of stuff. It's also really, really good at exporting, probably better than SSRS. If I recall, it has a lot of file formats that it can export to. And then something that it's also really, really good at is embedding. Also probably a little bit better than SSRS. My recollection with SSRS is that there was like a C# not plugin, add-in control, that's the term, that was available that you could put in your apps. There was a web view control, but Jaspersoft, I believe, has much better integration with, say, like Java applications and with web pages. So if you're not doing any of these three things, I really can't recommend Jaspersoft. And similar for SSRS. Now, where does it fit on the BI pyramid? So I like to think about business intelligence as this pyramid, starting at the bottom with operational reporting. So operational reporting is the reporting that, one, helps you operate your business. It helps you keep it moving along. But also it tends to be stuff that might be printed out or saved to a file. It's descriptive data. It is what it is, essentially. You're not adding a lot of business logic. You're not adding a lot of business context most of the time. So things like work orders, things like invoices, timesheets, all these sorts of things. Where at my last job, I wrote a lot of SSRS reports to be able to produce those types of documents. And this is at the base of the pyramid because you can't really move forward without having those needs met. But once you start to have the operational reporting, you can start adding analytical reporting. Analytical reporting tends to be asking why were sales up, why were sales down, and not just purely descriptive. Pardon me. And it tends to be taking a higher level view. So you're aggregating data, you're looking at key performance indicators, all this sort of stuff. And then at the very top, usually much smaller than this, so to speak, but is the predictive analytics. So this is forward-looking. This is trends, predictions, forecasts, machine learning, all that kind of stuff. So the question is, where did the reporting tools that we're talking about today fit? they fit squarely in the operational portion. So Jaspersoft and reporting services, or paginated reports, as you might hear them called today, very much clearly operational, not analytical at all. You can do some charts and graphs, but I can't really recommend it, right? Like the charting for SSRS is really ugly. They've made some improvements with 2016, but just really ugly. Whereas something like Power BI, it's much more interactive. It's much better at aggregating data. It's much better about adding context. And so Jaspersoft and SQL Server reporting services are both very firmly at the bottom of this pyramid. So SQL Server reporting services, I think we have some idea of how that came about, but what's the history of Jaspersoft? And why does it have like the TIBCO on the front? So back in 2001, so 20 years ago, there was a man named Theodore Danciu who was trying to create a reporting solution for a project that he was working on. And you have to think this was a long time ago. This was before SSRS was a thing. Crystal Reports was probably around back then, but there just weren't a lot of reporting options 20 years ago. And so later that year, he published it as an open source project on SourceForge. And then in 2014, he formally created a company to be able to make money from selling support. Because even though this was open source, back during that time, well, who here remembers SourceForge? That definitely is quite a bit of a throwback. But it was becoming more popular back then to have things like with Red Hat, where the software would be free and open source, but the support would cost money. Then a year later, in 2005, the first version of the product was released, and then a decade later, TIBCO acquired Jaspersoft, and it still owns the products. And so you might run into some confusion, like I did, about which products are free and which are paid, because the development tools are free, and there's still some open source libraries, but the actual server that runs them is not free. So it gets weird. And one of the things is there hasn't been a ton of development since then, as far as I can tell. Like if you go onto YouTube and you try to look up new features and videos for Jaspersoft, like there's barely anything in the past year or two. So I feel like the product's probably on life support. It may not be, it's not necessarily dying, but it's a 2-decade-old technology, depending on how you count, or 15-year-old technology. And so it seems like TIBCO is just trying to maintain the customer base that they have today. Now, for an added bit of context, back in 2004 is whenever SQL Server reporting services first came out as a SQL 2000 add-on, and then much more fully with SQL Server 2005. So these tools are of similar age whenever you think about it. Now, going back to that confusion, there's Jaspersoft Studio, and this is completely free and open source, and this is what you use to write and compile your Jasper reports. This is similar to SSRS Report Writer, or you might use Visual Studio to create your reports. But if you want to host the reports, then you need to look at paying for Jaspersoft Server. And then, more confusingly, there are Jaspersoft dashboards, which are some additional reporting functionality built into the server software, but they're completely, maybe not completely different, but they have nothing to do with Jaspersoft Studio. So they're a little bit more akin to like dashboards in Power BI or tiles on SSRS or that sort of thing. So very high level. So the important thing is Jaspersoft Studio is a report authoring tool. And that's what you would need to be able to create these reports. And so it's what you use to write these reports. You're creating these XML or JXML files, and it's built on Eclipse. So that's good and it's bad. So Eclipse is an integrated development environment, an IDE for Java. It's extremely popular. And so if you work with Java day in and day out, there's a good chance, a 50% chance that you have some familiarity with Eclipse. I've used it before for other projects. And I feel mixed about it. As a piece of software, it's fine, but my experience is that when it comes to open source software, the UI tends to be pretty bad, right? And that's my experience with Eclipse, is that there's a lot of menu choices, there's a lot of clutter sometimes. And so I'm not as much a fan of Eclipse as compared to, say, like, I love VS Code. I really like Visual Studio. Visual Studio has some of the same challenges in terms of clutter, but in my opinion, it's not as bad. Report Builder isn't that bad. And the only requirement to actually run all this is you need Java. So how does it work if I want to actually use Jaspersoft Studio? So first, you're going to create a project, and this is very similar to if you've worked with SSRS. And the project can hold certain shared items, like templates or data adapters, data connectors. Then you'll create your report. You'll connect it to a data source. You'll do a bunch of customization, and then if you have Jaspersoft Studio or Jaspersoft Server, then you might publish it to that. Or what you might do is you might compile these reports into a .jasper file and embed it into your Java application. In order to be able to run and display the report, you need a project and you need a data adapter. And so what is a report? So I think one of the best ways to think about it in terms of Jaspersoft and SSRS is that a report is a document plus data. When it comes to these paginated reports, I think that's probably the best way to think about it. And so just like a Word document or something like that, you're going to be adding elements to your layout. And there's a gradient here of how data driven they are. So you have static elements like pictures, lines, unchanging text, all that kind of stuff. And then you might have more dynamic elements where it uses an expression language to be able to determine what it's going to show. And SSRS is the same way here, where you might have something that shows a title, like maybe an invoice number for an invoice, and then or you might have something that shows the date that the report was run. You might have something that shows the page number. So you can have these dynamic elements. And then you can have tables and charts and all that kind of stuff. As far as customizing the report, you can you can add elements to the report. You can edit the contents of, say, a text box or something like that. There's tons and tons of properties that you can customize with the visuals. And then finally, you can have more dynamic kind of stuff with the expressions. And again, an expression is just code that returns a dynamic value. It is a small little bit of a program that is run whenever the report is run. And so you can have a lot of rich customization thanks to these expressions. And again, SSRS is exactly the same. The only thing that's different when it comes to SSRS is the expression language. So with SSRS, it uses Visual Basic, whereas with Jaspersoft, they have 3 supported languages. So there's Java, there's Groovy, which runs on the Java language runtime, but is different. It's I'm trying to think. It's basically just another option. I believe it has some syntax that some people prefer. You can think of it a lot like how you can run VB.NET or F# on the same runtime as C#. And then it also supports JavaScript as an expression language if you're embedding your reports into a web page. And I found this to actually be kind of surprising. So what are some shared features between Jaspersoft reports and SSRS? So first, they're both paginated reports. And as a result, they give you some really fine-grained control and detail over your report. They're ideal for printing and exporting. And unfortunately, they're both getting old. Again, if we count only from like the 1.0 release, then these are both about 15 years, 16 years old. And it kind of shows, right? In both cases, I don't know if I would recommend starting with these tools unless you had a very strong use case for paginated report. You knew that you needed something printed out. You know, maybe I'm biased because I do a lot of consulting in Power BI, but I think Power BI has a lot of more modern features and just general aesthetic. So, going to show you just kind of the basic run through with creating a report in Jaspersoft Studio and all of that kind of stuff. But before I do, does anyone have any questions either about any of this or anything with report tooling in general? Does anyone have any questions so far?
Sure. I do have one question.
Yeah.
I remember in SSRS, Microsoft, for some strange reason, decided that some features are going to be would need Enterprise Edition, some would need Standard Edition. Does it have the same in Jaspersoft as well? Some features are more money, some features are less money.
Yeah, so that's something that was honestly a little bit confusing, and I'll show you why. Jaspersoft server, because the answer is it doesn't look like it, but it seems like they have like an IoT edition. So I'm trying to find it. They have like 3 different editions, but it looked like the other ones were for running in like containers or that sort of thing. Trying to find. Let me see if I can. I'm trying to pull up the TIBCO page. But they didn't have a clear like standard versus enterprise kind of distinction. It looked a lot more like, okay, here's server, and then here's like the IoT edition or the version for running in containers or that sort of thing. Sorry, give me one moment. I'd like to be able to pull up the page. But that's a very good question.
I think KPIs were Enterprise Edition in SSRS.
That sounds right to me. We never had a huge need for them. Okay. Trying to. Oh wait, I think it was products. Appreciate everyone. Yeah. So here's what got confusing, right? So there's server, but then there's like Jasper Reports IO, right? So it seemed like there was the main server product, and then they've got like some sort of. Oh wait, here we go. Jaspersoft server editions. Okay. So they do have like professional and enterprise, and let's see. So there's some data virtualization kind of pieces, but it's okay. So it looks like their enterprise kind of piece is mostly just multi-tenant and like auditing and that kind of stuff. But the whole thing gets kind of frustrating trying to navigate because they've got a community edition and then they've got like reporting professional and enterprise. The other thing that's a challenge is from what I remember, and I was trying to double check this today, like it's very hard to find out what their actual pricing is. I mean, here they say it's by CPU cores, but I don't remember like when I was trying to look in, it was like call our salespeople, right? So
Yeah.
that's always a lot of fun. But that's a great question. I appreciate that, Steve. Did anybody else have any other questions so far?
Please feel free to ask, unmute
Yep.
yourself and ask, or ask through chat and I'll just voice it out.
Okay, so don't see anything yet. So we'll go ahead and move forward. So what we're looking at here is it says TIBCO Jaspersoft Studio, but what it really is Eclipse. So I think if I say about, it might tell us. Okay, so it does not say that, but you can see the eclipse.org, all that kind of stuff. And so it's, yeah, that's not going to help us, but it's based on Eclipse. And so, you know, it's a good, reliable piece of software. I've used it for Java development. I've used it for Adobe Flex, which probably no one here has ever heard of, but was, they took Adobe Flash and tried to make it into a way to make rich apps for mobile. But that did not last particularly long. And so again, the thing that's frustrating is like you have all these options and when you get to like preferences, you're just drowning in options. And a lot of times it's referencing things like Ant, which is a Java build tool that's not even relevant, right? But in terms of creating reports, if we do file new, we can do a new project. And so here I'm just going to run you through the just the kind of sample sort of thing. And again, kind of a frustration that like you can see it's got project types for source control, for plugin development for Java. And it's like, well, why do I need any of this? But if I go to project and we'll say LA Data Platform, and so what it's going to do is it's going to create a folder, and inside the folder we're going to have some JREs. We're going to have these Java libraries, basically. And so this is used for two things. So here's the whole Java language, and then we've got the library for Jasper reports. And then we've got the library for the server stuff. And so this is going to, I believe it's used for compiling the reports into a file format that can be embedded, but it also is relevant whenever we're using our expression language, which I'll be able to show you what that looks like in a second. So what we're going to do is we'll say, okay, now I want a new report, right? And so I'll say I want a Jasper report, and we'll go with coffee. But again, you can see here, this is all very much designed for printing, right? It's the classic paginated kind of reporting. And so here I'm going to just pull off of their sample database, but anything that Java can talk to in terms of data, Jaspersoft can talk to, right? It's very heavily based on Java. So if there's a JDBC connector available, you can use that. And so here we've got some tables in their sample database. And so I can just type a query and say select star from orders. And so one of the things is like, this should look, if you've worked with SSRS, this should look very familiar, right? This is like almost identical in terms of process. And so we can figure out what fields we want, and then we specify which ones we're actually. Let's go back. Let's add one more. And then we can specify what we're grouping on. And then we have this report. And so there's a couple things that we can do here. So first, the source is XML. I know it's super zoomed in, but you'll just have to. No, I think we can. You can see here with like com.jaspersoft, what have you, or java.lang.integer, it's referencing specific classes in Java, right? So it has to be a file type that it can convert to in Java. And so it's creating those classes. Here you can see here's the query that we had. And so again, just like SSRS, it's storing this as XML. The difference is that unlike SSRS, these are going to get compiled to .jasper files. We can also go ahead and go to preview, and it'll run the report, and we can see what it's going to look like. And again, we can go to the different pages. Here's where I think this excels compared to SSRS is there's just a tremendous number of file formats that you can export as. Now, some of these no one is ever going to care about. So ODT, ODS, those are open document formats, which again, if you're in the Java world and you're dealing with Linux, maybe makes a bit of sense. I haven't dealt with Open Office since I was in college, and I was a poor college student and didn't want to pay for Microsoft Office. But it's got just a significant number of file formats that it can export to. So that's one area where I think it has an advantage on SSRS. But we can go back to the design and we can see that, okay, let's edit this. And what it's doing is it's just running java.util.date. It's running raw Java code to get the current date. And it's been a while since I've programmed Java, but I think I can just concatenate a string. And so now if we run that, let's see if that, I think that worked. Here, yeah, you see it gave us the date, and then it's saying like test, right? So we can edit those expressions, and I do think it's actually pretty neat that it supports multiple expression languages. So it supports, like I said, Java, Groovy, which if you're heavily invested in Java, but you want a more modern language, Groovy's interesting. But if you've never heard of Groovy, then you definitely don't need to start knowing about it. And then JavaScript, which again, the embedding is pretty neat. I need to print paginated reports in a batch job. Do I need Jaspersoft server? That's a good question. I don't think you do if you want to use Jaspersoft. You know, I know it's easily embedded, but I haven't had to try and automate anything with it. Go ahead.
I think it's only we need the server when we have the end user coming to the just a portal and just viewing the reports. In that case, I don't have that requirement. All I need to do is print off some reports.
Oh yeah. So I mean, if you're willing to have like just like a human click something, then it's
a batch job.
You want batch job? Yeah. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't think you need it because I think you can run the Jasper reports library just straight through Java and handle it that way. But I am happy to actually find out for you. So
yeah, that's what I thought. You know, that I'm leaning that I don't need a report server because nobody can come check it out. They need the reports to be printed on a monthly basis. That's all. They don't care.
Right, and for something like that, it would be particularly good. And again, they have the community edition of both, right? So let me make a note. And then I posted my email in the chat, so please if you send me an email, I'd be happy to get you an answer. But I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think you need the server for that. I think that's more, like you said, kind of the UI portal, if you're not directly embedding into a Java application.
Right. Thank you.
That's a
great
question.
No worries.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, but please feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to hunt down an answer.
All right.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. What else did I want to cover with this? I mean, a lot of it's pretty self-explanatory, right? So I can take, we've got these static elements or these composite elements. And so, I could add an image of something. Well, I probably wouldn't want to add it there. But let's say up here, right? Then I could, I think I'd have to add, well, I could reference a URL or file or something like that, or I can add a static text field, and you can edit them here, right? So you can be like report title. And again, if you've ever worked with SSRS, it's all very similar. I can change properties of any of the objects on the canvas. So here I could change the, trying to find the font stuff. Well, here we could change the size or the positioning or something like that. Color. Let's give it a different color. So now it's red. You get the idea. And so again, really, really good for pixel perfect kind of work, stuff where it's going to be printed, stuff where you need a page number, but it can be fiddly, both SSRS and Jaspersoft. It's just that there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of settings, and so you have to know that you have this use case in mind to begin with. Okay, cool. So that's everything that I was hoping to cover today with this. I'm gonna hang around for a bit. Happy to answer questions about if it's about Jaspersoft, I'll probably have to look it up for you, but you have my email. If it's about SSRS, there's a good chance I remember a lot of stuff. Happy to talk about anything with Power BI. More than happy to talk about consulting or Pluralsight or that sort of thing. But otherwise, I appreciate everyone's time tonight. So does anyone have any questions about anything at all? Oh, here we go. Dynamic images. Oh, that's interesting. So I know for sure that you can kludge it or fake it with SSRS. So the way that you would do it with that, let's see if we can see it here. I've done that before. Let's see. I'm trying to think if we can see it here. Properties. So I know how I would do it in SSRS, and I'm trying to see. Okay.
This is
so I'll
or the portal.
Sorry, what was the question, Steve?
Yes. I guess in SSRS you can do different logo in the report, but you can also have a different logo on the portal.
Yeah. So I think the question, I think what Rajiv is asking about is within a report. And so you can, the way that I did it in SSRS was that I would have multiple logos stacked on top of each other. And then I would use conditional formatting to show it or hide it based on an expression. So that's the way that I did it in my last job. There might be a way to use the expression language to refer to different images, like different URLs or something like that. But that's the way that I handled it historically, was that because we had a report that was an invoice report, and we had multiple legal entities. And so the way that I handled it is like, okay, here's my 3 logos, and then I'm going to hide or show a different one based on what corporate entity it refers to. So that's the way that I've handled it in the past. If you've got a different use case, please feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to help you through that. But that's a great question, Rajiv.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? Again, happy to talk about pretty much anything.
In terms of graphs, what capabilities Jaspersoft has?
I believe it's pretty basic. Let me see if I can. Sorry, the giant font is is a bit of a challenge. Here we go. So they've got some room for visualizations, but I mean, you can see here, like they've got a dozen different options. They're all pretty simple. I mean, it gives me very much like a 2005 Excel kind of vibe, right? In both cases, both SSRS and Jaspersoft, at least in my opinion, the visualization capabilities are pretty rudimentary. I'm a big fan of Power BI when it comes to having to actually visualize data, or even Excel a lot of times, depending on what you're doing. Both of those have pretty advanced visualization capabilities, but if we tried to do like an area chart or something like that, you can specify your data series, you can do some customizations, but there's not a ton going on here, as you can see. So that's a great question, Steve.
Have you checked out Power BI's Paginated tool? I have not yet.
So funny thing about that. So Power BI's Paginated reports is just SSRS with the serial numbers filed off. It's the exact same technology. So the way that works is there's two options there. So the first option is Power BI Report Server, which is basically SQL Server Report Server, but with Power BI support and a different licensing model. So for on-premises Power BI Report Server, you're going to be paying for SQL Server Enterprise Cores plus Software Assurance, or Power BI Premium. So expect like tens of thousands of dollars potentially over the course of a year or two. Or there's Paginated Reports. Paginated Reports, again, they just genericized the name to fit better with the story for Power BI. But it's the same technology, it's the same rendering engine. For that, you either need Power BI Premium, so you're looking at like $5,000 per month, or Premium per user, which is fairly new, which is $20 per user per month. But it's pretty much the same. Like, let me see if I can pull up a page just super quick. So Power BI Paginated Reports.
They're expensive. Power BI.
So premium's super expensive, but premium per user is not terrible. But like Paginated Report for Power BI Report Server, this should look pretty familiar, right? Like they cleaned up a lot. Like the visualizations have gotten a good bit better with 2016 and moving forward, but it's the same exact technology. It's SSRS. They made the visualizations have, so I should correct myself. Before 2016, the visualizations for SSRS were really, really ugly. Since 2016, especially once they added in Power BI support, they've gotten a good bit better. But yeah, Paginated Reports, it's the same thing, just under a different name. So if we go Paginated Reports in the Power BI service, again, this should look extremely familiar if you've ever done anything with SSRS, right? It's the exact same technology. So great question.
And yet they couldn't push it to SSRS as well.
What do you mean they couldn't push it to SSRS?
Well, it looks like this is all SSRS technology that is a bit more polished.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair. No, that's a fair criticism. Yeah, I don't have a good answer on that, but that makes sense. Yeah, there probably is a little bit more polish on some of these pieces. Yeah, I think it gets weird with the org chart, right? Because I think the Power BI group and like the SQL Server group are separate, and it can get weird, but yeah, that's reasonable. Did anybody else have any other questions?
So if you were to compare Power BI to SSRS,
yeah,
can Power BI do everything that SSRS can do? Or there's still some things that only SSRS can do?
It's never going to completely fill that gap. I don't see that ever happening. And so the things that SSRS shines at, I 100% would keep using SSRS for. For everything else, Power BI is great. So the problems with, well, I guess I'll start with what I like about Power BI, and then I'll talk about why it's going to always have a lack, and why I think paginated reports are here to stay, even if it's under a different name. So sometimes you see Microsoft create a new technology and it's very clearly supplanting it, very clearly replacing it. So an example is DAX versus MDX for SQL Server analysis services. Like, I have not seen any interesting new features coming out for MDX at all, right? Like, I think that as a technology, it's effectively either dead or dormant. Like, it's not going away anytime soon because you have a lot of enterprise investment in the technology, but I don't see anything new coming out for it. So clearly DAX has replaced that, and I think it's capable of doing almost everything that MDX can do. There's some stuff that isn't supported yet, like writebacks, but in general, it's pretty good. With Power BI, I don't think it's ever going to get there. The things I like about Power BI, so I like that it has good integration with Office 365. It has good integration with authentication. It's software as a service, so you're just paying $10 per user per month. It's got really good tooling with Power Query for the data manipulation piece, which I think they backported some of that to SSRS, but I'm not sure. It's got really, really powerful data modeling with DAX, although the learning curve for that is fairly high at first for some of the mental concepts. It's got really good interactive reporting. You can click on stuff and it'll filter everything else on the page. You can drill through, you can hover, a lot of great stuff. But it was never designed with pixel perfect control in mind, or even close to that, right? And so the printing story, the exporting story for Power BI is awful. Basically, what you have in terms of exporting options is you can export as like a PDF or PowerPoint, and it's just taking a screenshot, right? And the problem is, if you have a table of maybe sales or something like that, and you're only showing 20 entries, but you have 50, it's not like SSRS where it'll just print another page. It'll just cut it off, right? So the the printing and exporting story is just awful. There is some ability to export data to Excel, but what you're going to find if you work with Power BI is there's a lot of formatting options, but there's not a lot of formatting control. So if you want things to look a very specific way, which if you're doing something like invoices, you do, then it's particularly clunky. So you have those issues. And it just really wasn't designed for this use case. So I think SSRS and paginated reports are here to stay. I don't see them getting a lot of love in terms of features and functionality, right? But I don't think they necessarily need it. I think, like you said, some polish is appreciated. They've made, as we saw on the documentation, they've made improvements with how the charting and graphing looks, which is good and appreciated because they used to be just ugly. But Power BI is never going to fill that niche. I would never, ever make an invoice out of Power BI, but I would do it out of SSRS, and I have done it out of SSRS, right? But I would only use SSRS or paginated reports for the things that it excels at. For everything else, it's just too fiddly. It's just, and so by fiddly, I mean like, you go to the properties pane and there's 20 different properties you have to sort through, right? And it's just like, yes, you could hand report builder to a power user, to a business user who feels comfortable with it. but I would never hand them like Visual Studio and say, here, make SSRS reports, right? Or in my experience, when I was working with SSRS, the data that was available to the visual depended very heavily on where in the report you were, whether you were in the headers or the footers, you were in the main part, or heaven forbid you had like a tablix and you nested them, right? It got really ugly really quickly, and performance became an issue really quickly if you didn't know what you were doing, if you were nesting stuff. Power BI, it's just one page, and it doesn't matter where on the page it is. It's not like Access, it's not like SSRS, where, okay, I'm in the header or the footer and that kind of stuff. And so it's a lot easier to train business users on how to use it, how to use Power BI. So yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think it's going away anytime soon, but I don't think it's getting a lot of cool new features either. I think they're going to do enough to make it so that if you're paying for premium or premium per user, you can get those needs met, because they tried doing SSRS in the cloud like years and years ago, and it didn't really work out. And so I think this is the second swing. And so they're going to do enough to keep the people willing to pay for premium happy, is my expectation. So yeah, I appreciate the question.
Got it. Is there a way to mix between the two?
Yes and no. So the short answer is you can pin reports or tiles from like Power BI report server up to the cloud. I know Paginated reports can read like DAX data sources, so you can share a lot of the data modeling between the two. I think there's some ways to like do a little bit of mixing, but most of it's kind of clunky. But in terms of shared data sets, you can do a lot with that. I think you can actually use a SSRS report as a data source even, if you like convert it to an OData feed or something like that. So there's stuff you can do that way. But there's nothing where you can just like gracefully just have like, okay, this is a SSRS visual and this is a Power BI visual and all of that. Okay.
More of a generic question.
Please.
Do you see future for standalone reporting servers, tools, studios anymore?
Yes. I mean, so you think about it, even Power BI has a desktop authoring tool, right? So if I go to, and like you can technically make reports in the cloud, but it's just not as fully featured. So I don't see desktop-based authoring tools ever going away. Do I see like Jaspersoft server? Do I see SQL Server reporting services server going away? And the answer is I see them diminishing, but I don't see them going away. Specifically, so there's Power BI desktop there, right? Specifically, I think that there's always going to be certain enterprises that are a little bit shy of going to the cloud, or they want more fine-grained security controls. And so you think about SSRS, you have this folder-based security capability. You can do nested folders, which you can't do with Power BI. So I think there's going to be some enterprises that always just want to have everything on premises managed. But for everybody else, like it's just so nice to have software as a service. You know, just being able to publish reports, create workspaces, and not have to think about it. It's just like with mail servers. You know, like who in the world manages an Outlook server anymore, or an Exchange server? Sorry. So I think the need for like Jaspersoft server, SSRS server, that's going to diminish as time, but it's never going to completely go away. I think desktop authoring tools are here to stay because you can just fit so many more features and capabilities and control in a desktop tool than you can with a web authoring experience.
Got it.
Yeah.
You can also pass them around without paying for the service.
That's true. Yeah,
I
I've
didn't
had at
say
least,
that didn't happen.
No. I mean, you can do it. It's a pain, but you can do it. So you'll find this funny, Elena. So with Power BI Desktop, you can, the desktop tool is free. You can pass around PBIX files. ClickView, by Click, it will encrypt the report files that you create with their desktop tool, so you cannot do that. It is absurd. Maybe that's changed, but back in my last job, we were playing around with ClickView. And so if I made, like, the tooling was free, right? But if I made a report file, unless I paid money, I could not give you that report file. It would be encrypted with some key tied to my desktop.
So what would source control look like on that then?
Yeah, really. Well, the source control story on Power BI is pretty awful today, right? Like, that's one of the things that is a selling point for both Jaspersoft and SSRS. Because it's XML, source control is really, really easy, and they both have decent support for it. But you think about it.
Because it's not just like using it, right? I mean, technically I could create a report and then give it to my user, like send it to him and he could access everything. But if you have a team of 10 working on reports and today I'm working on it and tomorrow it's someone else, like I should still be able to open and do everything and
So, yeah,
have
I mean,
it function the same.
Yeah, with ClickView, if you pay money, then you're able to decrypt the stuff, right? So it's just more about, like, making sure people aren't getting around stuff with the free version. Now with Power BI, so here's the interesting thing. PBIX file, don't tell Microsoft this. They know, but they don't like it when I say this, right? So if I rename this as .zip, it's actually just a zip file, just like a lot of Office files, like a docx. And so, it's not particularly human readable, right? But you can do it. So I could open up, I hate opening up XML files with Notepad, but you get the idea. And so the problem is that zip files are really bad for source control because the data essentially looks as if it's random, right? Because compression makes data look random, and so one tiny change ripples through everything else. There are third-party tools. My recommendation, if you're looking at Power BI and you're like, well, we want to manage source control, there's some third-party tools, but a lot of times what is beneficial is with Power BI Desktop, you can point at an existing Power BI data set. And so a lot of times if you want to collaborate, what I recommend is you make a kind of golden data set for your set of reports, and then have these thin reports that don't have a data model. They're pointing at the data set in the cloud, right?
Okay.
But yeah, you can totally try before you buy. And, depending on how much you're willing to pay an inconvenience, you 100% can pass around the PBIX files and use it for free. 100%.
What happens if you open it in Notepad++? I see you have that.
Oh, yeah.
Is
thank
the
you.
format better? Like, is
A
it
little
more
bit.
XML readable?
Yeah, let's see if I can extract. Hold on. Yeah, good call on that. So extract. So let's see. And the short answer is kind of. So I don't do.
I don't remember if it comes with the XML formatting.
Yeah, it does.
By default.
It does. It's got the color coding and everything. It's got word wrap, so it's a lot easier. But a lot of it's like, it's still hard to understand what's going on. So data model is going to be just complete gibberish because they compress it. It used to be that you could human read a little bit, but it's compressed, so it doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's funny though, because like in here's like THI, this backup was created using XPR Express 9 compression, right? So that part you can read, but there's a bunch of nulls in between, probably because it's some UTF variant that has the nulls. And then there's Everyone's just asleep by now. They're like, why aren't we digging around in internals? There's connections. I don't think there's anything in there, but in this one, but you can also see like the Power Query and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the PBIX format, because it's a zip, is really, really bad for source control. And Microsoft has not provided a good answer to that, right? Like proper, like put it in Git or TFS or something along those lines. There's some third-party tools that can help with that. The official answer from Microsoft is put in OneDrive, but they're getting better with the DevOps story. And so they've got a functionality called development pipelines, which means that you can move these reports from dev to test to prod more easily. So there's at least that.
Yeah, but for larger organizations, you have to, like, there's no way you can't just do this.
Yeah, and there's, like I said, there's kludges and workarounds. Sometimes what people will do is they'll use tools to export the Power Query code and the DAX code, and so they can at least track it that way. It's a pain, right? Because like I had a customer project where we lost almost a week's worth of work because we ran into some strange performance bug. We couldn't quite diagnose it. And thankfully, I had older copies of the report. And so we went back like 4 or 7 days. I mean, thankfully, it wasn't like 40 hours of work or anything, but still. And we fixed the problem that way. But if I had source control, I could have just like stepped my way through. But
is there something, because I know in AWS on an S3 bucket you can enable versioning. Is there something like that in Azure where you can enable versioning on your bucket, and then every time you save, if you're saving it to?
yeah, I mean, there's
I guess that's kind of like a version
that's what
of
they
source
recommend
control.
with OneDrive is you basically
Okay.
you that's what they recommend. Microsoft's official recommendation is you basically do that with OneDrive. The issue is that you have the data model and it could be taking up a significant amount of space, right? That's why I recommend doing the like hub and spoke kind of model of the reporting where you have one file. So like, here's a customer project, and I've got one file. This is, a meg. That's the data model. And then I've got 3 that are the reports that point to that data model. And so the benefit is, okay, if I go through 20 iterations of a 44 kilobyte file, it's not going to take up a lot of space to track those versions, right?
Oh, okay.
So it's not too bad. The problem is, one of the things that's great about source control is you can do like git blame. And you can be like, okay, what was the source of this change? When did we change this? You can do that with SSRS and Jaspersoft because it's XML. And I've done that where it's like, well, what changed since the last time this was edited? With Power BI, there's no great way to do that. But yeah, the current recommendation is basically you do something like this and you just put it in OneDrive and just upload every time you do a change, and then you have version history if you have that enabled.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no, happy to help.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For
Thank you,
joining
guys.
us.
Have a
Azure Data
wonderful
Platform.
evening.
Yep, you too.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.